Great. But actually, some of the stuff that I'm going to talk about might actually shed some interest, a little interesting light on why, on sort of my taste and where I'm coming from. And okay, so this is my copy of To the Lighthouse from when I was in college. It has all these underlines in it from then, and it actually even has some notes in it, I think, from later, from grad school, and then when I was writing about it for something else. And so this is the same copy I've been walking around with. So I don't remember exactly what year in college it was that I read it, but I'm going to call it 1981. Okay. And I want to give you a little context about 1981. Those of you who weren't here in 1981, which are some of you for sure. So in 1981, the National Book Award went to John Updike for Rabbit is Rich. And the finalists were Mark Helprin, John Irving, Robert Stone, and William Wharton. The Pulitzer went to A Confederacy of Dunces. Yeah. The National Book Critics Circle Award also went to Updike. And the finalists were Robert Stone, Russell Hoban, Donald Barthelme, Leonard Michaels. Are you catching my drift here? Okay. The bestsellers, the biggest bestsellers of the New York Times that year were written by James Michener, Martin Cruz Smith, James Clavell, Stephen King, John Irving for the Hotel New Hampshire, and Colleen McCullough. You can see some, I think you can see some trends there, right? I think you can see. Now, I didn't know about any of this. I was in New York. I went to Barnard as an undergrad, but I'm sure I read the Times, but I had no idea what was happening in the sort of currents of power. I was wildly unaware. And also, I had come out maybe a year before that. I was about to move into a third-floor walk-up on 109th Street in Amsterdam, and I cut my hair to like concentration camp length with the kitchen scissors. It was a different moment. Reagan was president. AIDS hadn't happened, or actually it had happened. The first article about this odd disease actually ran in the Times in 1981. And at that time, we could still take checker cabs down to the Duchess, which was a really famous lesbian bar. It had been there since the 50s at Grove and Christopher, and that is now a Starbucks. So I don't remember what class To the Lighthouse was assigned for. I'm sure it was assigned. Woolf had made her way into the canon by then, although she wasn't as canonical as she is now. She was in there, but she was a little more to the side. And everyone that I knew was reading Shulamith Firestone, Andrea Dworkin, Mary Daly, people that I don't know if you even know who they are. But the writing was, they were very, very radical feminist writers at the time. And the work was really filled with, there was a lot of violence in it, because a lot of it was about like violence against women, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so here comes To the Lighthouse, which is this family in Edwardian England on the Isle of Skye, right? And they're all having thoughts. And they're having a lot of thoughts. But I connected to it immediately at that time in my life via the image, via the surface of the writing, via the intense beauty. I also knew that she had committed suicide. And I mean, remember, I'm like 19, okay? So, all right. I knew that she had committed suicide. And my grandmother had also committed suicide, which was a mystery that I was incredibly haunted by. And I almost certainly got to Woolf aesthetically through Updike, who was someone that I had read when I was a kid, and I really didn't understand it. But that profound pleasure in the language, the prevalence of image, this is what really blew me away, okay? Another thing that I did not know, you could actually write a book about what I did not know. Another thing that I didn't know was that in 1981, Raymond Carver published What We Talk About When We Talk About Love, which became, you know, like kind of one of the minimalist texts that's now all over every single writing program. That book, Anatole Broyard, who was still passing for white, called it atrocious and a double disingenuousness reflecting on itself, which I would say there's a little self-acknowledge that, you know, he would know. But one of the things that I didn't know was that all of this richness of imagery that I really, really adored and that was in contemporary writers like Updike was about to be completely swept out of fashion by minimalism, right? Lydia Davis was going to do Break It Down in 1986. Ann Beatty was already on like her third collection of stories. And I had no idea about any of this. And I also didn't care at all. What I wanted in Woolf was I wanted the imagery, I wanted the interiority, particularly women's interiority. I wanted to be unbound by plot as such. And I also wanted a really wild amount of beauty. All of these things, in ways that I both can and can't explain, were bound up by queerness. But it was not the queerness of Lily Briscoe being in love with Mrs. Ramsay, which I have to say I never buy. I didn't buy it in 1981, and I don't buy it now. I mean, I think she really liked her, but I don't, what I think of as passionate romantic love, I don't actually feel that in the text. On page, well, in my copy, on page 164, I'll show you what I mean. There's this little tiny image. And Mrs. Ramsay is looking at her kids at the table, and she says, she's looking at her daughter Minta, who she wants to marry off to Paul. And she says, some excitement, some anticipation of happiness was reflected in her, as if the sun of the love of men and women rose over the rim of the tablecloth, and without knowing what it was, she bent toward it and greeted it. Now, that image in content is obviously very heterosexual, right? It's like men and women, and it's like the sun, and right, that's all great. But the way that Woolf saw so strangely that hyperpermeability of image and scene, the incredible freedom of it, the inversions of scale, the inversions of foreground and background, the way that the visual and emotional planes kind of collapsed together. Again, I don't know quite how to, even now, I don't know quite how to express that, but there was something in that of queerness, of looking queerly, which is what I was incredibly in love with at that moment. Also, I think the other thing that I also was incredibly in love with in this book is where it ends in Lily's marginality. This maybe was going to be problematic for me later in my life, but I really love that Lily's marginality, at the very end she says she knows that the painting is not very good and it's going to go into attics. But she says, I have had my vision, right? And when I look back, I mean, it's incredible when I look back on this book, I think I loved that. I love it right now. I love it to this very minute. And in fact, in the most recent novel that I published, Wonderland, it's this indie rock person who's trying to make a comeback. And the last words of the book are almost there, right? Almost there. And so I think that To the Lighthouse had this like almost there-ness that just really lit me up. The permeability, the repetition. They keep on trying to go to the lighthouse, go to the lighthouse, go to the lighthouse. And then they actually get to the lighthouse, but then you're not really getting to the lighthouse. And there's the lighthouse and the other lighthouse, and the lighthouse is right, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The re-seeing of scale, the incredibly attenuated causality. Now I can see this in just about everything I've written, definitely in 3 out of the 4 novels that I've made. And I say that despite the fact, or maybe because of the fact, I don't know, but after the early 80s, I went off Woolf for a while. I was kind of like, I'm done with you, Virginia Woolf. You were of my youth, and I'm past that now. I got a little closeted about the beauty thing, not about the rest of it, but it got to be very dicey to say, I love beauty. You just couldn't, that just wasn't done. It still isn't done, basically. So I really I went away from her for quite a long time. And I also needed to read other things and do other things and write my own books. But then I came back. I came back in recent years. I also came back in my own work. I got to a place with lyricism where I thought, honestly, fuck it. I'm just going to do whatever, I'm just going for it. I have no reason not to, and that's a whole other lecture, but I really re-embraced it in my own work. So I want to just show you something about one particular run of images. In my book, it's in 146 to 147. Now 8 candles were stood down the table, and after the first stoop, the flames stood upright and drew with them into visibility the long table entire, and in the middle a yellow and purple dish of fruit. What had she done with it, Mrs. Ramsay wondered, for Rose's arrangement of the grapes and pears, of the horny pink-lined shell, of the bananas, made her think of a trophy fetched from the bottom of the sea, of Neptune's banquet, of the bunch that hangs with vine leaves over the shoulder of Bacchus in some picture, among the leopard skins and the torches lolloping red and gold. Titus, brought up suddenly into the light, it seemed possessed of great size and depth, was like a world in which one could take one's staff and climb hills, she thought, and go down into valleys, and to her pleasure, for it brought them into sympathy momentarily, she saw that Augustus, too, had feasted his eyes on the same plate of fruit, plunged in, broke off a bloom there, a tassel here, and returned after feasting to his hive. That was his way of looking, different from hers, but looking together united them. Now, now all the candles were lit up, and the faces on both sides of the table were brought nearer by the candlelight and composed as they had not been in the twilight into a party round a table, for the night was now shut off by panes of glass, which, far from giving any accurate view of the outside world, rippled it so strangely that here inside the room seemed to be order and dry land. There, outside, a reflection in which things wavered and vanished waterily. which is what it says in the book, and it's what it says in other editions too. Some change at once went through them all, as if this had really happened, and they were all conscious of making a party together. So what is amazing to me about this image, that I certainly didn't understand in any conscious way when I first read this book, was that the engine of transformative intimacy, the agency in the scene belongs to the flame, right? It's the light in the candle that begins by drawing the table into visibility. It seems as if it makes it appear. And then it adds the fruit, and then Mrs. Ramsay transforms that into an image about the bottom of the sea, and then Bacchus, and then it becomes an alternate world. And then, this is the thing that blows me away, it brings Mrs. Ramsay and Augustus together. And if you remember from reading the book, she kind of doesn't like him. She thinks he's kind of icky and creepy, and he kind of is icky and creepy, right? And she says, but looking together united them. So that the light brings the object into the world, the object becomes an image, a thing that one looks at, and then that unites first these two people, and then everyone, right? The light composes, the faces on both sides of the table were brought nearer by the candlelight, right? And then they were all conscious of making a party together. So the light, the image, makes them aware of their communion and their togetherness, right? So this is astonishing to me. I did not understand that. I had to go away and write like 3 books, get a master's, fall in love. I don't know, a million things had to happen. And now I see this, that it's the image of the candlelight that first brings them together and then lets them know it. They see themselves as that group, which I think is just astonishing. You know, it's one of the main places where I feel like, I don't know how she did that. A kind of ecstatic, an ecstatic co-seeing, right? But looking together united them. That's Woolf. I mean, ecstatic co-seeing is what she was great at, and the sort of, and it's a beautiful. I mean, you know, you read great depictions of more conventional kinds of love, right? Like, we fall in love, we have sex together, things happen, we get a dishwasher, you know, whatever it is, right? Lovers are torn asunder by fate, you know. Those are beautiful visions as well, right? They're visions. They're artistic renderings, right? That are as real and as not real as being a human being and being in love. Ecstatic co-seeing happens, and one of the things that I still find incredibly just like, it just kills me about it, is her enactment of the idea that there can be ecstatic co-seeing among all these different people who may not even like each other. I just find that, maybe it's because I'm a big old scopophilic 20th century product, I don't know, but I just find that really interesting and moving and kind of beautiful. I mean, you know, it holds out a kind of hope that doesn't require us. it doesn't require anything of us in terms of identity, right? If you and I look at a shell and we say, my God, look at that amazing shell, right? And we're both totally blown away by this shell, nothing is required of us, together or separately. We can have an ecstatic co-seeing, and there's sort of an astonishing hope in that and an astonishing freedom in that I do find very, very moving, and that's where this book lands. It's really not a celebration of Victorian womanhood or Edwardian womanhood. It really isn't. Then I really saw her brilliance, and it applies to this book too. I was looking at Jacob's Room, and I was looking at the intense visual patterning in Jacob's Room, okay? And if you guys have read, has anyone in here read Jacob's Room? It All Happens in His Room, okay? Or have you read Kew Gardens? Have you folks read Kew Gardens? Where it's like, you should read Kew Gardens. It's very small, very, very short. But what happens in Kew Gardens and what happens in Jacob's Room is that she is using, again, this kind of super omniscient narrator in which the narrative point of view flows seamlessly among everything: insects, people, color, water, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Scale is continually shifting, okay? And in Jacob's Room, she uses this aesthetic to tell the entire story of Jacob's life. He's born and then he dies in the First World War. Often without him being literally present at all, okay? He's part of this larger pattern. He's a refrain, a textual recurrence, but it's this collection of repeated impressions that cluster around him, okay? Jacob is the point around which the world of the novel revolves rather than the character driving it. And what I started to understand, there's a little moment here from Lily's point of view. She's looking at Mrs. Ramsay and James sitting in the window. She felt, too, as she saw Mr. Ramsay bearing down and retreating, and Mrs. Ramsay sitting with James in the window, and the cloud moving, and the tree bending, how life, from being made up of little separate incidents which one lived one by one, became curled and whole like a wave, which bore one up with it and threw one down with it, there, with a dash, on the beach. So what I began to understand is that this is actually Woolf's genius. And it's also an ethics. It's a radical angle of vision that essentially removes the boundaries among characters, removes the boundaries among human beings and the natural world, and renders it all part of a wave or a pattern or this larger music. And this was the move that she made with Jacob's Room in 1922, and that she then continued through Mrs. Dalloway into The Lighthouse in 1925 and 1927. And if you go back to that long section I just read about the image and the candlelight, right, you can see that it's there too. It's this union and communion that on the one hand is what we would call eros, right? It's connection, but it's also thanatos because it's this dissolution of the self. And of course, Mrs. Ramsay is very close to her own death in that passage that I just read. So I teach writing, and we talk a lot about craft. I hate craft. I never actually want to hear the word craft again as long as I live. This is craft, okay, I guess, but this is vision. This is an ethics of seeing. This is being blissfully unaware, okay? This is also And it's both the glory of it and the heartbreak of it. This is what I can't do. In other words, this is why she's a genius. And the older I get, the more I appreciate the genius that she was. Because what she did is she removed essentially one element, one very, very basic element of what we would make any fiction out of. And she created something else that's an aesthetics and an ethics and a radical way of looking all at the same time. If I could do that, I don't even know what. I wouldn't need to shop. This is her brilliance. And it's also, it's very moving because the way that she sees is actually the way almost no one sees, the way it's almost impossible to see. So what she could do in her work was this kind of reaching for almost like a cosmic communion that you can't get. You cannot get there. I mean, maybe you can get there like on acid for like an hour or something, but you can't get there, right? It also makes her not reducible, to me, it makes her not reducible or claimable by any faction or interest. I mean, this was, I'm sure, already happening as I was like blithely, like, you know, chopping off my hair and running around and whatever I was doing, you know, she was really like taken up by a certain kind of feminist criticism, which was great, but everyone was kind of like picking her over to get what they needed from her to create the movements and readings and et cetera that they needed. But I don't think that she's reducible to any one faction or interest, because of this radical way of seeing, right? And actually, they have this horrible quote on the back. It says, from the Saturday Review. This must be from when the book was published. It says, there are dozens of passages in which the secret relations of men and women, especially women, to the trifling events of life, are rendered with convincing and elaborate subtlety. To have written them is to have surpassed, in this one respect, almost every contemporary novelist. So whoever wrote this in the Saturday Review in 1922 or whatever was like, well, she looks at this one really weird little thing that like only women look at, and in that one way, she's pretty great. That's what they're saying, which is hilarious. So it's amazing because when I was looking at this to come and talk to you guys, I couldn't actually believe how deeply this book got into my DNA as a writer. That was really astonishing to me. Well, you can imagine that in a lesser writer, right? That image of the candlelight, that would be the end of the book, right? That would be the end of the book. Like, and then the candles, that's like the Lifetime movie, right? Then the candles, and then they were all there. The end. Without the death of Mrs. Ramsay at the end of the first section, it would not be as great a novel as it is. Mrs. Ramsay is the ideal, right? She is that ideal figure. And I think that I would agree with you that what Woolf is doing is she's kind of unpacking the layers of that ideal who is not in any way in resistance against the status quo. Do you understand what I mean? Right? She's the angel in the house. She likes it. She's great at it. right? She's fantastic. And he likes it, and she likes it. And it is, you know, as you say, I would agree in a way that Woolf allows it to exist on its own terms and without resolution. Every character in the book is using her. I mean, they are, right? She literally made them. She made all 8 of them. And then she is this kind of vessel through which all of their desires pass. But then it's hard to have the book, right? In other words, then if you've done like Feminism 101, you're like, well, okay, but I think Mrs. Ramsey clearly, well, she has a lot of agency because, and it's like, no, or yes and no. Being admired isn't being used?
I missed that.
I said being admired isn't being used? All of the dialogue is completely banal. Right. What dialogue there is people saying to each other, well, we can't go to the lighthouse, it's going to be wet. Right. I want to go to the lighthouse. You're wrong. Well, we must go now. It's time to go to the lighthouse. I mean, it's sort of awful, right? And, oh yeah, they're all complaining about each other all the time, right? But it's in that, it's the way that she's continually, as you say, putting the sublime next to, right? It's this sort of extraordinary folding and juxtaposing that she's doing that's a lot of where the energy of the book is coming from. And she really, you know, she really goes to town on Mr. Ramsey, about whom she is completely hilarious. There was this passage, oh God, I'm going to lose it again, where she's thinking, well, he's such a great man, and he's such a great man, and his great mind, and, oh God, where did it go? I had it today, and then I lost it again. But they're walking out on they're having a walk together, and she's thinking, of course he's very great, and he has a really great mind. But look, are those rabbits over there? And she's thinking about, right, she's thinking about the rabbits. So it's like, yeah, I guess you're like the great man, but really, what about those rabbits? And what about, she's also thinking, she wants to show him something that's happening in the tree. Do you know what I'm talking about? Right? What's happening in the tree and the star in the tree, but she's like, well, he won't be interested in that. You know, it's just the universe. Why would we pause to be interested in that? So Woolf is continually, I mean, the way that she, the juxtapositions around Mr. Ramsey are hilarious. And also, of course, the tropes that she makes out of Mr. Ramsey are fantastic. His whole thing about, I mean, I remember this made such a huge impression on me when I first read this book, that he's walking around thinking, great thinkers have gotten to Z, and God damn it, I'm stuck at Q, and all I want to do before I die is get to R, and which is incredibly funny. And also, it's such an amazing way of belittling him and putting him in his place, right? It's like, well, he's such a great man, he can barely say the alphabet, really, is what she's doing. But it's also a brilliant way of analogizing and compressing advances in thought, right? I'm not going to get to R either. Woolf went A to Z and then back again. But that way of hyper-compressing, you know, he's a philosopher, so you can imagine, right, where this is actually, you know, Hume, la la la. And she's like, no, it's just like the alphabet, and we're trying to get to R. And it's so brilliant. It's so brilliant. So again, you can see that thing with scale, right, where a candle gets 5 pages, and the entire progress of Western philosophical thought gets 1 letter of the alphabet, which is also in ethics and a politics, right? I mean, it's clever. It's an incredibly clever way to deliver that to the reader without taking them through pages and pages and pages. You can imagine in another writer would be like, well, Mr. Ramsey, you know, he had thought about Kant for a great deal of time, and his, we'd get all his musings on Kant and all this stuff, and it would be really boring. It's a really fantastic way to compress that, but it's also a commentary. And yet she does, she has an astonishing way of presenting people both within their sort of musics of self, that also contributes to the larger music of the whole. Do you know what I mean? It's like as if Mr. Ramsay is like the bassoon, the buffoon and the bassoon. He's, you know what I mean? He's the bassoon in this composition, and he does have that. He feels that it's his cross to bear, his splendid isolation. Well, there's another passage. Love had 1,000 shapes. There might be lovers whose gift it was to choose out the elements of things and place them together, and so, giving them a wholeness not theirs in life, make of some scene or meeting of people, all now gone and separate, one of those globed, compacted things over which thought lingers and love plays. Which to me is a passage where Lily is saying that the love of which she, anyway, is capable is the love of the artist, right? That there are lovers whose gift it was to choose out the elements of things and place them together, and so giving them a wholeness not theirs in life. That's an artist, right? And that is the way that Lily is a lover. As for Mrs. Ramsay, the jury's out, and it's been out for me since 1981. I don't know. I am not in love with Mrs. Ramsay. I don't know. But in the book, the act of love, and in that part at the end of the window that we were looking at, where Mr. Ramsay is sitting there thinking, I wish she would just say that she loves me. And she's like, I'm not going to. And he can just figure it out from how I look at him. Ha, I win. That's not great on the intimacy scale. The completed act, the only really completed act of love in the book is Lily having her vision for her painting. That is really the only one that remains. Do you remember whose emotion we see in terms of Mrs. Ramsay's death in Time Passes? Who do we see? Do you remember? No, it's that image of Mr. Ramsay lurching down the hall. Right? I beg your pardon? With his empty arms, yeah. It says, here's Mr. Carmichael who was reading Virgil.
Tell us what page.
Yeah, sorry. Here we go. On mine, it's 194. It's the very end of section 3. Mr. Ramsay stumbling along a passage, it's in a bracket. Mr. Ramsay stumbling along a passage one dark morning, stretched his arms out, but Mrs. Ramsay, having died rather suddenly the night before, his arms, though stretched out, remained empty. What do you make of that bracket? What do you make of it that it's in a bracket? Now remember, Woolf has said of this book that she felt that her parents' marriage weighed very heavily on her, and she needed to write into it to understand it. This is her writing her parents' marriage. Okay? So what do you think about that? But Mrs. Ramsay, having died rather suddenly the night before, right? She's in a past perfect clause. His arms, though stretched out, remained empty, stumbling along a passage one dark morning. What do you make of that? It's always, there's the sort of narrative of the ego and the superego, right? Which you could also say the narrative, which you could also say the ego and the superego is history, right? History is like, well, What happened? World War I, right? But she's not writing from that, to your point, she's not writing from that point of view. She's like, no, what's important is consciousness. What's important is unconscious and subconscious material. So World War I, someone else can tell that story. That gets a bracket. And the actual death of Mrs. Ramsay, no, I'm not doing like a Dickensian deathbed scene and the little children weeping at the, whatever, like in the crow, she's not going to do that. She's going in a past perfect clause, right? Wolf is hilarious with the parentheses. World War I happens in a bracket. It gets a bracket. I loved that. Okay, that to me was like crack. I thought that was the best thing I ever saw. That all of this stuff you could just go like, boom, right? Just like toss it in the trash bag. I was like, this is going to work out for me. That is really good. When I was in my 30s, someone that I knew who was also in her 30s died. It was really shocking. She got a really bad cancer, and it was diagnosed, and within like 8 months she was dead. And she was someone that a lot of us knew, and she was kind of a gal about town. And so they had a memorial service for her, and she was pretty accomplished, and there were all these people who like traipsed up to give their eulogies, and they all said, she went to Yale, she spoke these languages, she did these things, she had these accomplishments, all of which were like really lovely, and that you could read on her CV, honestly. They could have like published her CV. Her last girlfriend, what turned out to be her last girlfriend, got up, and in her eulogy, she talked about some funny things that the woman who had died had said in the middle of the night. She was like a sleep talker. And the one who got up at the very end was by far, she wasn't like part of the class of these people. She was like an outsider for like a million reasons. And this is to your point, I was so moved by that because I thought, the woman who died, the kind of CV-worthy things she did, they're not going to go away, right? Like in the sense that they're written. But the person who remembers what you said, the dumb thing, the funny thing you said in the middle of the night, that dies with you unless someone says it. Anyone could say all this other stuff. Only the person who had been there could say that. And I thought, you win. You win the eulogy smackdown. Right? And I think that is very much part of Woolf's, what you said is part of Woolf's aesthetic, that there are great novels of the wars, right? Of various wars. But those histories are known, whereas many of these other things are not known and will be gone, right? And I think that is absolutely part of what she was doing. Someone was just saying to me the other day that she wanted to do like an encyclopedia of lost gestures, like the gesture of like picking up the receiver of the phone, like when there was an actual receiver and like the little thing that you had to push down, right? That there's a whole bodily vocabulary that's gone, and that no one's going to remember pretty soon, right? Or care, and all of these things will go away, and that's an aesthetics and an ethics. What do we need to honor? The things that are huge or the things that are going to pass? Yeah.